Of course, I'm also here to introduce two speakers this time. The first one being Jeremy De Beer, Associate Professor at the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Law, and co-principal investigator for the A.I.R project. And Chidi, and that's the more complicated name, Oguamanam, professor at the University of Ottawa as well, affiliated with Center for Law, Technology and Society, and steering committee member and senior researcher for the A.I.R project. The floor is yours.
I'm very privileged to be back at the global conference again, and it's my delight to thank the organizers. And my task this afternoon is to talk about our project, the A.I.R project. As most of you may have been noticing, since we've been talking about intellectual property all day long, there has not been any African speaking about African affairs. And that is essentially how it is in the global intellectual property order. And so, the A.I.R project about which I'm going to talk is a major research initiative through which we are seeking to address Africa's marginalization in regard to formation of intellectual property policies, and more importantly, the valuation of African contribution to innovation. And that marginalization, so many people have argued, stems from a lot of factors, but one of which is the fundamental flaw in the intellectual property system that refuses to, as Peter was saying this afternoon, to account for the knowledge production process in the so-called marginalized or alternative cultures. And that is where Africa is located. But most of us here know that Africa is perhaps one of the most creative societies that human civilization has ever known. But unfortunately, in the intellectual property system, Africa is always around the footnote area. And so what the A.I.R project seeks to do is to begin to map out a strategy for bringing an African voice to intellectual property lawmaking and policy formulation. And that is the mission of this project. But then one of the difficulties is that there is a deficit in local capacity even to conduct empirical research that could capture African innovation profile and impact, and that could actually also impact policy outcomes. So 2 points are important for the future of African innovation. First, there is need for a truly independent African-driven initiative to project African voice in intellectual property matters. Second, that can only be possible through a mobilization of what we call a Pan-African social capital in intellectual property, and that is preferably through a network or partnership model. And that is what the A.I.R project aspires to do. Our expectation is that Africa, through this kind of project, will be able to reclaim a space for itself in the intellectual property system. And this is a system that has historically denied Africa its own contribution to the global basket of knowledge. And in the next video clip that I'm about to play, I invite you to hear the voices of some members of our group in the partnership and the passion with which they speak about this project. After that, my colleague Jeremy De Beer will speak also about the impact of this project so far in the African continent and globally. Thank you.
First and foremost, I think probably I'd say excitement. That's the first thing I think when the project was first mooted to me. And to us, I think it's one of those projects which will be able to harness quite a bit of the the intellectual capacity that we have in the continent. which I believe has been untapped for various reasons. So I think it's a vehicle within which we can actually exploit the resources, more so in terms of innovation and creativity.
Well, to be part of the Open A network is very important for me personally and my research partners. For me personally, I've always sought to be involved in research that makes a change. Research that's important, that's going to have a benefit for Africa.
I would like us each to finish the workshop by giving our own vision with one word.
Continuity.
Helpful. So mine is democracy.
This project pretty much builds on a previous project, the African Copyright and Access to Knowledge project. We started to conceptualize a new project that to some extent builds upon what we had done in ACA2K.
ACA2K was a key basis for the current project. It created the core network from which OpenAI has drawn.
So I'm thinking also, given the gap we want to close in the concept of how Africa is represented in global intellectual property lawmaking process, Afrocentric intellectual property.
Frankly, even in its history and evolution, the concept, or as we know it, the Western concept of intellectual property was not designed with African creativity and innovation in mind. And therefore, African narrative or experience has never been adequately represented in the evolution of intellectual property rights, and more so in the knowledge economy that we have suddenly evolved into.
On the one hand, we're trying to understand what's happening right now on the ground. So with various case studies in the context of the creative industries, in the agricultures, in the context of how science and research is being done at university level and the intersection with the intellectual property regime, then we're trying to extrapolate that and imagine what would be the best world in the future and what would be the best intellectual property regime from an African perspective.
So my word is relocation. I see Africa as the center of innovation, IP, everybody rushing to Africa and everybody saying, I want to be there.
Taking the research further, working towards outreach and working with policy leaders, that for me is quite important, and I think that not many academics have that opportunity, so it's an immense opportunity for me.
So a project of this nature that seeks to mobilize African resource, African narrative, African interest in the global intellectual property lawmaking and policy to identify the gaps is definitely a well-conceived project. It's in urgent need for serious undertaking.
Because I think what has been happening in the last 10 years is more so to do with capacity building. So it's time to actually see what that capacity that has been built can be able to contribute in terms of development, in terms of just moving the continent forward.
This is probably the only significant network of researchers on intellectual property in Africa, and so being part of it is of course a great privilege and an opportunity to learn and to network with researchers working on different things.
This is a privilege actually, so it would be very nice to capitalize on that and be sustainable beyond the project. So commitment is the most important thing, and trust of course, and I think working together, I mean this may sound cliche, but when the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and I really believe in this, the networking effect, where the benefit is really more, it's a collective benefit rather than just being divided to smaller parts.
Thank you very much, Chidi, for that introduction. What I'd like to do with the next 5 minutes to conclude our presentation is to visualize some statistical data to show you what this community has already done and what it can do in the future. Now, this is based on a theoretical framework established by Elinor Ostrom, or solidified by Elinor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on governing the commons. She demonstrated how social capital is integral to collective action. Social capital is essentially the resources that are embedded within a network of relationships. Not the network itself, but the assets that can be mobilized through a network. We weren't just interested in the theory of social capital. We were interested in how it works in practice, and we still are. So in practice, we're trying to understand what our network does and can do using the method of social network analysis. Social network analysis allows us to quantify, statistically analyze, visualize, and then mobilize the social capital that our relationships within our network represent. How do we do this? We surveyed our entire network. We got a very high response rate because of the sense of community that our network members have. We used the survey data to identify three key metrics, to map our network based on three key metrics. The first is connectedness. Now, connectedness essentially counts the number of connections that a person has to other people within the network. But we all know that it doesn't help to have a great many connections if you're not connected to the right people. So the indicator of betweenness starts to measure the kind of connections that people have. And it counts the number of times that an individual is on the shortest path between all combinations of everyone else in the network. It's a very complex mathematical model, but it gives you a sense of whether a person is a bridge builder or a broker, or looked at from another perspective, a bottleneck. You can also measure closeness, which is the distance of connections. It's the distance it takes for a person to get to every other person in the network. Now, using mathematical modeling and software, we were able to visualize our network. You can see that if we just look at physical monthly interaction, our network is clustered geographically, with the yellow nodes being in Southern Africa, the red nodes being in Eastern Africa, and the purple west, and the physically isolated northern network if you look only at monthly connections. But because of events like this and other opportunities, we've been able to bring our researchers and our community together. And this is what our network looks like if you look at how we communicate physically, how we interact physically biannually or more. And the network looks completely different. And because of these opportunities for physical interaction, when you ask people how they interact virtually on a monthly basis or more often, we see a much more interconnected and integrated network. And this has real power. I'm going to give you one example of how that power can be mobilized for concrete action. And Ahmed spoke about this morning. This nondescript sign is outside of the venue in Brazzaville, Congo, where the African Union's Ministerial Conference on Science and Technology was taking place to adopt the Pan-African Intellectual Property Organization. These people were going to constitute an organization after 2 years of negotiating a statute among a very small committee with no public participation, no public consultation, and we believe a real danger to the public interest. So what happened? This is procedurally Africa's ACTA. We learned about an opportunity to act only 3 weeks before the meeting was scheduled to take place. And in a situation like that, you need to ask yourself, how do you need knowledge to move when you have 3 weeks to intervene and make a real difference? Sometimes you want knowledge to move very widely, and that can be a powerful force, as we see in the Poland protests over ACTA that we discussed earlier today. But we didn't need information to move widely in this context. We needed information to move quickly, and we needed information to move influentially. But moving information influentially is only worthwhile if it moves reliably. So through our data, through our social network analysis, we were able to identify, in hindsight, only a handful of people, of the 60 people that we surveyed in our network, who would meet the criteria of being able to mobilize this information and act upon it quickly, influentially, and reliably. And it happened to be that Ahmed Abdel Latif met Dick Kawuya through PIGIP's working group on limitations and exceptions. And because of that fortuitous, coincidental meeting, he happened to run into one of a handful of people in our network who could make this action happen. Now, if you look at the statistics here, Dick is actually not a very popular person in our network, and I can say that because he's a close friend of mine, but he does not have a high degree of connections in or out of him. He's not highly connected. There are other people in the network who are much more connected quantitatively than Dick Kawuya is. But Dick has a score of betweenness that is off the charts. And what that means is that Dick connects more people in the network who would otherwise be unconnected than almost anybody else. Moreover, when we surveyed our network for the qualitative factor of who Dick's closest collaborators were, who trusts Dick the most, it was the people who are highly connected to a lot of people. And this is important because when Dick says, we've got to move on this, now's the time. We don't have time to commission a study. Dick needs to tell the people who trust him that he's doing the right thing. And through that, this petition was launched. And in part because of the Open Air Network. I don't think we deserve to take credit by any means, but in part it contributed to a movement that stalled the adoption of the Pan-African Intellectual Property Organization and has given us time to study the issue. And as we heard earlier today, sometimes a delay is in itself a victory. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We can map our social network by gender, by country, by occupation, by seniority, and all kinds of other factors. The potential of social network analysis to actually crunch the data and mobilize our empirical research for policy change is exciting. And if you're interested in learning more, we've got a working paper on building social capital through research to improve intellectual property policies in Africa. I hope you'll attend the rest of the Open Air events that we have scheduled throughout the next 2 days to learn more about the empirical research that we're doing. And I would be remiss if I didn't end by acknowledging the invaluable support of our funders, IDRC and GIZ, and our partner institutions in North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and the center of our project at the University of Cape Town's Intellectual Property Unit in South Africa. Thank you very much.